All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening for those of us joining us for this exciting session, how FDA and payers utilize RWE, similarities and differences. By way of introduction, my name is Praveen Jadhav. I'm CEO of Vivpro. Today, we're going to discuss a topic with Dr. Brigham Hyde, CEO of Atropos Health. I'll have him introduce in a minute. Before we get into it, just few housekeeping notes. Today's webinar is recorded. We will invite your comments and questions, and you can locate the chat box on your screen. On mostly, it will be on the right bottom side of your screen. If you are experiencing any technical difficulties, please reach out to Holly at vipro.ai, or you can direct message her on this platform as well. And at the end of this session, we'll appreciate your feedback by answering one brief question at the end. So let's get right into it. Why is this topic interesting for us? The reason the topic is interesting is in the 21st Century Cures Act, as all of you know, was signed into law on December 13, 2016. And among many provisions of the Cures Act, FDA was asked to create a framework for a program to evaluate the potential use of RWE. And we have a perfect guest who can answer from both sides, from the FDA side, payer side, and give us his perspective on where we want to go. And I look forward to discussing case studies with Dr. Brigham Hyde. And hopefully at the end of this webinar, you can see the role of RWE that is played in the regulatory decision, role of RWE for the payer decisions, and we'll discuss few case studies that where RWE has played pivotal role in regulatory decision, but also what does it mean for the payers. So with that introduction, I will hand over to Brigham and have him introduce himself. Brigham.
Thanks, Praveen. Thanks for having me. Great. So just a bit of a background on myself. So I'm CEO at Atropos Health. We're actually focused at Atropos on bringing RWE to the point of care, and we'll touch on that a bit, particularly in the payer context as we go through. But prior to this, I was president of data and analytics at Eversana, which is a global life science commercialization platform. Helped to build our RWD and RWE offering there, along with great colleagues, focusing on providing support both on the regulatory and payer side, market access side of communications. Part of that, I was at a venture fund called Symphony AI and led the investment and co-founded Concert AI in the oncology real-world data space, and led the partnership with ASCO CancerLink there, as well as operating the business and leading the use of that data for oncology RWE research. Prior to that, Chief Data Officer of Decision Resources Group. I call this sort of the early days of RWD, RWE, back in the mid-2010s. They've ultimately sold to Clarivate since. And once upon a time, Praveen and I have a unique commonality, which is we're the rare PhD in clinical pharmacology in the world. And the first time we met, I know we hit it off over that. So I started as a bench researcher, a clinical scientist by training, but have been building RWD and RWE businesses as investor, entrepreneur, operator for the last 15 years. Great to be here.
Thanks, Brigham, and an impressive background. So congratulations. So let's start off actually with a simple question for our audience. We both of us utilize this word RWD or RWE. What is it? Is there a difference or are they the same?
Yeah, it's been a bit of buzzword bingo last couple of years. I wrote an extensive LinkedIn post about this if anybody wants to look it up, but I'll try and offer a simple definition in my mind. Real world data is data that is either being passively or actively collected about patients from the real world. And the digital world we live in, this is now taken on many, many flavors. I think the classic view of real world data is that it might be EMR data, much of which was created as part of meaningful use, parts 1 through 3 in the late aughts into 2010s. But honestly, could include other things like claims, digitally collected information, biometrics, omics, You could even say behavioral health or socio-determinants of health. I sort of don't cap the definition of what we might consider real world data, other than a very precise difference. It's being collected from the real world, meaning a patient is not necessarily actively enrolled in a prospective clinical trial where we might be collecting data on a specific cadence or as part of a specific protocol. So it's sort of protocol-less in its collection. You could even argue that clinical trial data is now working its way back into this definition. But that's how I think of it. Real world evidence now is what we do with that data. And ultimately, what you're trying to do is produce evidence for a specific treatment, a course of therapy, a guideline, a protocol, an FDA label, what have you. And it's sort of the analysis of that data that then becomes evidence. And I think on a holistic level, think of real world data as having less constraints. Anything could be real world data, I guess. But evidence requires that it's actually showing demonstratable proof. It also has what I would say are different grades. So people will say something like regulatory grade, real world evidence. What they're really meaning is the sort of standards that might be set around how well a certain piece of data can be analyzed and used for a certain proof point. I know we'll get into this in greater depth here, but it has to do with the consistency of that data, its completeness, its quality, and I believe for its fit for the question being asked. A simple example that I give on this is, if we're asking a question about demographic groups, and I'm looking for, this is something we deal with at RWE Health, I'm looking for an answer on treatments for Asian Pacific Islanders, and I'm using a real world data set that doesn't include any Asian Pacific Islanders, you might say that's not a great fit for evidence generation for that question. And so I think that'll be an important topic as we go through in the future. Today, it's really about transparency, auditability, completeness, and quality, and how it fits to the question and is appropriate for the statistical technique being used. So that's, again, longer post explaining all the wording nuance that I just mentioned, but that's how I think about it.
Very nice. And do we really need it? I mean, we have been doing trials for ages now. Why do I have to worry about this another piece of data? What's the reason all of a sudden for at least last 5-6 years, where, as you said at the beginning of this conversation, buzzword is coming? What's the real need?
Yeah, being a pharmacologist makes you also an FDA and regulatory wonk. So I could go back to the 1970s and the fen trials if you wanted to discuss this. But what emerged in the regulatory environment in the mid-century, last century, was the idea of clinical trials as a gold standard. Removing biases that existed, some cases inappropriately before that. And coming up with a method where the public, regulators, insurance companies could really look at what is our top level evidence, where can we go for a consistent answer. And while that is terrific, and I think remains the gold standard and is critical to regulatory paths and is not going to change in that sense, I do think we ignore what that leaves out and the reality of that, which is, if you look at, and we've published on this through RWE, and Dr. Shaw at Stanford has a strong background here as one of our co-founders, most clinical trials exclude most patients, right? So there's a great stat where something like 75% of patients with chronic comorbidities are excluded from clinical trials. Yet if you look at healthcare spending, the people actually being treated by the healthcare system, they make up 65-70% of the cost of our healthcare system. So we have these great gold standard trials, but they are not covering the people who are receiving the care. And that is a disconnect that I know regulators feel, right? If you're approving a drug based on a limited clinical study with a high degree of inclusion and exclusion criteria, then you're being asked to approve it, and it goes out to the rest of the world, or in this case, the nation, and it's going to be given to people who might have been left out of the trial. That's a concern, and I think there's a gap in evidence. That's one of the things that's driven this sort of evolution and drive behind real world data and real world evidence. And that's not even to mention all the health equity components of that, whether we're talking about demographic groups, talking about low income or rural groups, certainly women, breastfeeding women, pregnant women, children, rare disease. The amount of trials actually being run in these patients is smaller than it needs to be. And the question comes up, well, if we've been collecting all this real world data, would that give us a different viewpoint or fill some of the gaps, either at the regulatory step or later on as we're making guideline policy, protocol policy, or deciding what to pay for? And I think the broader point I would have is, any other part of our lives, data is being used to instruct and personalize almost everything from, how you buy your car insurance to, what home you should buy to your retail options. It's more of the standard now. Even Netflix tells me what to watch, right? Why are we in healthcare sort of sticking our head in the sand to some extent, not factoring that in? We are, and it's evolving, but because of various regulatory components and also security components, it's been slow to the game. I think it's sort of inevitable. And I think we're at the point right now where we really have to be thoughtful about, how we define the real world evidence grades and, the use of the data appropriately. But I think there will only be more because of that unmet need from the current standards that are out there.
Perfect. I mean, the evidence gap, I think, as you mentioned, is recognized by payers long back, but more so with FDA. So for next few minutes, let's kind of look at each stakeholder at a time, the FDA, the payers, the guideline group. So let's start off with FDA. As I mentioned at the top of this webinar, the Cures Act really propelled FDA to think about real world data. They have done some publications. I pulled up a few of the examples here. And just a shout out to a recent CPT edition on role of real world evidence that they have summarized. So Brigham, for you, give us an idea of how is FDA looking at real world evidence or real world data at this point in time?
Yeah, let's talk about at the guidance level first, and then we'll get a little more practical. I mean, obviously 21st Century Cures laid out a roadmap. There's been an active community of researchers, of industry members, of other stakeholders sort of contributing to the evolution of that thinking. And there's been some things tried and attempted and sort of experimented with, leading to the draft guidance earlier this year, which tried to outline a little bit more how we may look at the use of real world data. And I think I see a progressive FDA being really thoughtful, but also trying to move the ball forward. I think they want to close that gap that they saw. They also, if it's possible to help this accelerate cures, I think everybody's all for that. And certainly if it's going to improve representation of patient classes, I think that's great. I would highlight a couple. I mean, while I was at Concert, we interacted and partnered with the FDA. Sean Cozen, who led FDA's Cedar Oncology at the time, he's now running ASCO Cancer Link. Amy Abernathy, who had been at Flatiron, then went to the FDA, also played a distinct role here. And even Dr. Robert Califf, who's now commissioner in waiting at the FDA, he comes from the background with that Duke Margolis group that's really been forward thinking on it. But really, there's a global set of researchers that are pushing these ideas forward. If we get really tactical, okay, and we consider the FDA, we also maybe consider Europe and HTA submissions. The use of real world data is not exactly new, right? So you might, if you're preparing an FDA submission, you're going through your FDA meetings, you might bring data from the real world to those meetings to help instruct trial design or think about patient selection, think about endpoint selection. The literature itself, which you often cite, includes maybe phase 4 evidence, might include other population studies, registries, things like that. They're being used in sort of the day-to-day pick and shovel work of designing regulatory submissions. I think the sort of big line and big opportunity maybe, but also something that requires a close eye is things like synthetic controls. And, could I use real world data as a control arm to a clinical trial arm that was being actively used in a live patient population. There have been some examples in oncology around this that have been leveraged. And I think it's important to understand where that's coming from in oncology as we sort of flex it against what's going on more broadly. In oncology, often in late line studies, phase 3, late phase 2, you may be dealing with a late stage, population that essentially you might only be able to recruit patients to the active arm. They're in tough shape. They've been through therapies. This is maybe a little bit of a last hope. And when you do a single arm study and you bring that back to the regulators, it can be interesting to look at that. They may factor it in the label. But honestly, from a statistical bias perspective, from a sort of rigor perspective, we want double-blind controlled trials. That's what we want, and we want them to enable that evidence generation. So the opportunity to use a synthetic arm when it wouldn't have been practical or even ethical to put somebody in a control arm or placebo or even a standard of care that might not exist, I think that's a place to start. And there are some examples that have been out there around that. I think to get way in the weeds, okay, the challenge, there was sort of an initial surge around that, and one that was done thoughtfully. The challenge is that you're not going through randomization when you do that. And for those who, again, putting the FDA wonk hat on, but the essence of randomization is about a concept called equipoise, which is if you imagine a site-based trial and you have people being put into arm A or arm B, maybe arm B is the placebo and arm A is the active arm. Equipoise is the bias that a physician who might be enrolling for that trial might have. They might put one patient in one arm over the other. So the combination or the concept of randomization was created to help deal with that, which is basically to say that the physician can't exert any bias there. They'll be mathematically randomized into each arm, regardless of background or, if they like their color shirt that day or, who knows what, right? And that in the statistical community is a really important concept that ensures the statistical validity of the trial. If we're using a synthetic arm and we're comparing it to a real world arm, there is no literal point of randomization happening. And the concern is that real world data has some level of equipoise issue in it. I mean, you're dealing with somebody who might come into a practice and maybe it's their favorite patient, so they happen to give them treatment A or follow-up B or some level of attention. There might be inter-site bias going on that we're not completely aware of. And so that fundamentally is the challenge with using synthetic control arms for label level regulatory studies. Now, I would be in the camp of people who thinks that sounds like a fun statistical problem to try and figure out. Is there a way for us to measure that bias, correct for it? And there are techniques available for that. And in certain cases, when you're weighing risk and benefit, we go back to these late line oncology trials, it's better than single arm in many cases to attempt to do this. And you might not treat it the same as, two-armed evidence from a controlled trial, but it's instructive. It also adds a really important voice, which is you're getting a better view of what's happening in the real world from the synthetic arm, which you're not getting in the trial because of the inclusion and exclusion we discussed. So I think it's a concept which is evolving. When you look at the draft guidance, I think there's a lot of consideration about how we might construct synthetic arms, grade data for it, statistically attempt to remove some of the biases or risks associated with equipoise, and make that a more standard method. I don't think that is solved, and I don't think that the standards are final, but I can maybe discuss as we go through some of the ways people are trying to deal with that. Taking a slight step back from that, I do think if that's like the A1A, synthetic control arm piece, there is other things going on. I think the FDA is increasingly discussing with industry about how to use real world data really all along the clinical development process to help give them insight into that real world view and really into how you're shaping and designing your trials. And many industry partners I know start thinking about their real world data strategy and evidence strategy as early as phase 2 and are running it throughout. It can also be used in different settings and communications. I think where there's a little uncertainty is what the FDA wants in their, sort of full regulatory package versus what they might want to discuss at different meetings. And, when I look at the guidance, I think they're still a little uncertain about that question too. That's leading to some of the newer technology models I'll point out, and we'll come back to this a little later, about connecting real world data with clinical trial data and thinking about more of a contiguous environment there. But I find the regulatory approach so far to be very thoughtful and, considering the right things. And this is not going to be figured out overnight, but I do think we all agree, if there's data out there that can be used to generate high quality evidence in a consistent way, in an audible way, and it can enhance the voice of the real world patient that's actually receiving this, and potentially also be an accelerant to cures, I think it's something we should all invest in. So I'll pause there.
Now, very interesting. In fact, I would like to invite our audience to this discussion because what I understood from you is, FDA people have submitted the RWE to FDA regularly. But when it comes to decision making, there's still a lot to think about. And I think I would actually go back to this slide we had from the Cures Act. And while you're talking, actually, it just made sense to me why the framework was limited to help support approval of new indication for drugs already approved and support post-approval. So FDA is progressive, to your point, but also have held back few things like approving a drug completely based on real-world evidence, or going away from some set standard. And I think what you just said about a lot of things that they need to figure out, and probably even the Cures Act limited FDA authority to only these. Any thoughts on being even more progressive? What would it take for FDA to be more progressive on this?
I think that they're at the right level right now. I think, if I think about the way clinical trial regulation evolved, and again, I'm putting my FDA wonk hat on again, and you go back to, the early days of that, and, all the way from Tuskegee to Fen, through to PDUFA and the way that evolved, what we really want to avoid is a drug being approved on trial data or real world data that is later proven to not be accurate, or perhaps even fraudulently falsified. And I think that is a hard line that we need to deal with. Clinical trials are governed by 21 CFR Part 11 compliance, which actually dictates how data is collected, stored, retained, audited, and so on, and provides a lot of the protections that are needed to ensure that the trial data, is what we say it is, and can be levered appropriately for those decisions. The real world data industry or evidence community is not regulated that same way today. And I think that's a lot of what the standard setting we're headed for is. And, back to our work at Concert and with ASCO, CancerLink, and others, I think the right standard is some version of 21 CFR Part 11, which, just to say what that might mean, it might mean that if you're going to use real world data, it needs to be captured and stored in a form that can be retained. If you're going to do things like curation or enhancement to data, whether that's through NLP or AI or synthetic data, you're going to need to have a clear paper trail on how that was done. And you're going to need to be able to judge the cost or the quality and compliance of that throughout its process. Now, I'd say good news here. I actually think the tech infrastructure exists to do this, right? And it's sort of a best practice approach right now. But I think it needs to be ultimately probably set aside as sort of a level of rigor that's required for certain regulatory submissions. And most folks I know in the industry are working to that most of the time. I want to make one point here, though. That doesn't mean if you're not at that level or meeting that level of compliance that we should throw the data out the window and it's not useful. It still will be. It's just use for what, right? And I think that sort of framework needs to be fleshed out. There's some great work that's been done with Friends of Cancer, which is sort of a nonprofit group. It's really done an awesome job at sort of think tanking that idea and comparing different approaches throughout. There's other groups that think about this often and publish on it. I also think the European agencies have got more active in thinking about these standards. So, I'm quick to say we probably need some standard setting. I think we're coming there, and I think people are thinking about it. At the same time, I'm also quick to say let's not throw out everything else, right? Because it can be used perhaps post-approval. It can be used more dynamically to instruct and advise, but maybe not to the same level of, a label or, even sort of new indication approval and things like that. So I think that's where we're headed.
Very nice. So what we'll do is let's switch the stakeholder, because I think we have been talking about FDA, where, as you said, approving Ibrance for male breast cancer was probably at the right stage. Perhaps they need a lot of things to be figured out before more such actions are taken. Switch to payers. Educate us on how do payers use RWE?
Yeah, I mean, the answer is they use RWD all the time, and they have for a long time. I mean, if you imagine from the payer perspective, you're reliant on the evidence that's produced from clinical studies, and your interpretation of that as best you can. Also, the analysis of data you see on an actuarial basis to determine that. And the place to look here is to look at the policies, medical policies, guidelines, formularies, things that they put out. And oftentimes they cite real world studies, be that a phase 4 approach, be it a registry, even now looking at observational research and the rise of its use, that's being cited directly by these policy committees, which are made up of doctors. And, let's go back to the physician, because that's what we care about at Atropos for a second. Like, doctors are doing their best to interpret all this evidence and figure out, what it means and is it appropriate. There's also a rise of this amount of evidence, and it's increasingly personalized. So, I think payers are used to it. Pharmaceutical colleagues, work often from the medical groups on creating new medical evidence once a drug has been approved. Classic world, that was, your phase 4 study or maybe additional follow-on studies you would run. But increasingly, RWD and RWE are great ways to do that. And again, add voice, add nuance, add personalization to how well your therapy is working. Is it all that standard? I'm not sure about that. It relies heavily on the peer review community in publications. So in general, needing to go through peer review, having your methods evaluated by the publishing community is the way that's done. I would say I don't always know how consistent that is. And being outside, the conversation we're having about quality and auditability, I think the publishing industry is a little late to how they consider data sources, how they consider methods and determine level of evidence. But that's why you have things like NCCN, or you have, other guideline communities that are meant to sort of discuss and pro and con these things and do their best to process that. I think it could be faster, would be my argument with Atropos Health. But, again, not new. And I think maybe the place that RWD and RWE and all this sort of cascading evidence is really starting to play out is in the payer community. And you start to get to topics like value-based agreements. And, how are we going to structure those? How are we going to measure those? Isn't RWE or RWE, the best way to do that? And, I think our infrastructure to do that is coming along.
That's very, very interesting. So basically, what I understand from you is FDA can choose not to act on RWE because they don't think evidence is sufficient, or they can manage in the label. And we'll discuss gene therapy in a minute, how they kind of have a tool of indication. But for payers, if they choose not to treat, it will come and cost them in different ways, because there will be some other cost they'll have to bear if they don't make a treatment decision, either yes or no. So it's almost not a choice for payers, actually, whether they should use the RWE, correct?
I think that's right. And the stakes are rising for them in a number of ways. I mean, you have increasingly expensive drugs. You mentioned gene therapy, and the cost of some of the newer therapies, cell and gene therapy as a category is going to require this type of support. But, when you have to make an individualized decision about coverage that has a huge economic swing, I think needing more personalized evidence to do that, more detailed evidence, and evidence based on how they're actually going to perform. Because, if we're talking about sort of the value-based side of the world, or even just think of a payer who, is governing formulary and also medical policy, if it's leading to hospitalizations, if it's leading to, procedures, transplants, they're the ones picking up the bill for that. So wanting to have, a clearer picture on who to use this for and who not to, I think is already happening, and certainly will be driving forward.
Nice. So, rather a provocative question. So, as you just said, payers you have been utilizing RWE, RWD for a long time. But whenever we look at publications from that where FDA has utilized RWD, RWE, it's oncology. Is RWE means oncology for regulatory decision?
I don't think so. I mean, at Eversana, we focused heavily outside of oncology and chronic disease immunology. I think there's great opportunities, different expertise required, different level of data, different data sources. But, what I would say about that is FDA is always a risk reward type of entity, right? And it's thinking about those things. And I think there were challenges in oncology that were presenting themselves. I mentioned, the sort of single line therapies and smaller studies and underrepresented populations where the stakes are really high. And I think both the agencies and the public's ability to sort of try things is maybe best there. I think there are other parts of the FDA which are further away, right? And I think of the areas of, psychology, psychiatry, the neuroactive substances, like that's a more challenging area on the RWD side that I feel like is not close, right? But if you think about, where the opportunities are, where the stakes are, it's wherever there's underrepresented populations with unmet need. And I think those things will drive it forward. And as standards are set, the other areas will follow in, and the approaches and details for them, I think, will be soon to follow.
Very nice. So your advice to us is wherever you cannot do a study or have some challenges that cannot be solved by randomized trials, make up a case, and perhaps even their real world data may help there, because you can talk about the prevalence and what patient population exists and why we can't do a study to make a case like that.
Well, here's the thing, and I think FDA is setting the right tone right now, but and this is a personal opinion about the industry and technology and data for me, not necessarily how I would view it as a regulator or even as an executive in the space, but the fact that there's no putting the cat back in the bag. There's going to be more data tomorrow than there was today, and more types and more insights that can be drawn, more techniques on top of it. It is coming, and it is not going back. And, if we look at, digital health, the personalization of health, throughout our industry, I think it's more a matter of, coming up with logical approaches to it on a regulatory basis, factoring what's coming, having a way of dealing with that change. But it is here, and it is only accelerating. And I think having the mindset that, this is part of the story now, and, how do we want to play in it, I think is the approach. I think the FDA set in the right tone, been very progressive, and, I feel like we're in good hands on where that's going.
Good. So I want to bring up an example here that when we were talking about what could we talk about, and I love this example that you brought. So just for the audience, let me set this up. This is a product that was recently approved, and it is indicated for primary hopefully I pronounce it correctly, hyperoxaluria type 1. And it is an FDA says to lower urinary oxalate levels in pediatric and adult patients. And here are two studies. One I think it was a placebo-controlled study, and the other one was a single-arm study of multiple doses, and clearly showed that the urinary oxalate levels change compared to placebo. Perhaps even on the right-hand side, a single-arm study can show it has a similar effect. But Brigham, you have some thoughts on what's the dilemma here? Because to me, when I
Yeah.
look at the product, it showed what it's supposed to do. So what's the dilemma from payer side here?
Yeah, I think this is a cool example because, and again, this is sort of the rare disease category where we're dealing with a specific type of therapy to correct molecular issue, right? That leads to this, um, you know, rise in urine oxalate, ultimately leads to multiple, sort of renal system issues. And, the FDA and the study that was designed looked directly at that topic. It's like, well, did it do what we hoped it would do around this specific metabolite? And it does. Okay. And I like this example in the context of like where, should regulators start and end, and where should payers, begin and end, and how's this going to work? This creates a really interesting conundrum. Okay. So in the real world, once you get out there and you think about a physician prescribing this and how you might determine if it's working, right? On the one hand, you're looking at, well, did it lower urine oxalate, right? Like that's the message. What you're really doing is using that as a proxy, a clinical proxy for, did it prevent further renal dysfunction, further hospitalization issues, treatment issues, was it curative, these things. And what's interesting about this is it creates a problem in the real world for the payer pharma discussion, right? So like from this example, are these the right levels of reduction to expect in the real world? Based on the label, I mean, we know what it looks like in a clinical trial, but this has a constrained population of, certain groups. And is this what you would actually see in the real world? Is this the right range? Is this, higher or lower than you would expect? I mean, there's no sort of instruction on that. And that gets even more practically interesting when you think about measuring it in the real world. Is it working, right? So because we don't have the view of what the range of urine oxalate levels are in these patients in the real world from the label, you get out in the real world and it's like, well, what is the right level? Is it right to have this level maintained for 2 months, 3 months, 5 months? What actually happens in the real world? And there's sort of a funny problem where it's like, if I were, thinking about this as a payer, like, okay, well, I should just stick to the trial. Great. And then I try and go figure out if these patients have urine oxalate measurements every month for 6 months. And I quickly find out they don't, right? It's like, and maybe the test got screwed up. And what if I have a bad read? So how can I tell, if this is within the range of, the effective treatment? And by the way, the real question then is, well, does pinning to this very specific, measurement, what does it actually lead to in terms of outcomes? Like, in other words, would a wider threshold have been okay to prevent hospitalizations or, other major events? And, ultimately, if you're a payer, it's like, well, does it really save me money in terms of the cost of this patient and the cost of their coverage? Do they improve? Like, what's the symptomology view of this? Like, how are they managing disease? And it's sort of an interesting conundrum where, let's just say, the FDA were to, only look at clinical trial data ever, right? And only approve in this manner. Yet they create this big problem the minute it hits the market and nobody knows really what to do. And I wonder what, in this case, perhaps, a real world arm would have showed. It might have shown, or even in a descriptive way, instructed how to translate, what this efficacy measurement meant into the real world, instead of leaving it, to that sort of later on-market debate for it to happen. By the way, there's also a practical problem, which is like, let's say you're a payer and you've got to go figure out, like, okay, well, what was the urine oxalate measurement for this patient? There's just a data infrastructure problem. Where am I getting that from? Like, where, like, how am I getting the provider to give it to me? And is that a paper, scanned record I'm getting, or is it digified and are the units right? Like, so all of these things start to create like practical issues when things hit the real world, which ultimately at the moment tends to leave people like staring at each other, not knowing what was right. But I'm all for, detailed clinical measures and labels, and, especially in the case of, a mechanistic therapy like this. On the other hand, the practicalities of how that label is going to play out once it hits the real world, is sort of left looking. And I would offer, okay, that maybe the direction something like this goes, and I think folks are thinking about this, both regulators and industry and payers. What if we were able to link this patient level trial data to the previous EMR history of those patients, and to, after they leave the trials, track how they do? So you get this continuous view in and out of an active trial. I'm seeing this from a number of the industry partners and collaborators that I've worked with on the data side are starting to think about, like, well, is there a framework where at different points somebody could be in passive collection of data, could be in active collection? Could we get the consent right for that? And could we still have the unit of the trial, but then also be able to reanalyze as new information comes in, do that safely and securely with all the appropriate HIPAA compliance? But, think about this patient, throughout a lifetime, and use that sort of ever updating information to help people understand more as like a tangible, evolving real world asset, what's actually going on with these patients. And then for the patients who receive it, who weren't in the trial, who are in real world data, factor their data into that same reanalysis. So I imagine us heading to more of a continuum, where people are sort of in their patient lives, in and out of trial environments or trial studies. But there's also the ability to link in other information for reanalysis later, whether that's at a de-identified level or, for their individual benefit. I think the good news is, from a cloud computing, from a data security, from a DID perspective, I think we have the technology to do this. And now it's a matter of thinking about the infrastructure, where it needs to live, how to consent appropriately, and then bring value to the various pieces of the system. So it's an interesting example to think through.
Absolutely. Again, we are heading to the final stretch, so I'll invite again the audience to put in any questions you have. I see a comment, one of our colleagues at Sequester, they probably do the data connection that you just talked about. So please.
Well, yeah, I'll give Artie a free shout out. So basically, in the infrastructure I'm talking about here, if you're able to gain that consent and you need to ping to get records, I think they've done a really good job of being able to reach the tentacles across many different systems, many different types of data, and be able to pull that record back. I think it'll be a really important part of how this evolves going forward, and one part of multiple solutions that are needed, but they've done great work there. So Artie, there's your shout out.
Very good. So as I said, please feel free to ask any questions here. So continue on this topic. You mentioned that we need to figure out a lot of things before a wide adoption. So what do you think needs to happen if we were to get more pragmatic studies in labels? We have one so far, Janssen's risperidone, or we have few examples where a population not studied has been was supported by RWD, RWE. What do you think needs to happen to increase the adoption of these data and evidence?
I think honestly, it's about setting some of those standards we talked about earlier, because that's what's holding people back a little bit. Let me just give you and again, as somebody who's worked in this industry, I feel like I've probably seen it all in terms of data consistency, inconsistency, the challenges with processing it, everything else. But let me just tell you what we're worried about. Okay. So let's take oncology RWE, where very often now, if you're looking for the stage of disease of a patient from a passive collection source like EMR, there's no field that lists stage. I guess Flatiron sort of has a fielded view in their EMR. But really what you do to get staging if you're in a trial is somebody examines the radiology of the tumor, They're looking for, often, let's take solid tumor, size growth in the tumor, meeting certain criteria like RECIST criteria. And they're going to document that as a clinician. You're going to be able to look back at the image to determine that actually happened. It did grow or it didn't grow to the right amount. When you're dealing with EMR data, you might have that, note from the imaging team. You might have the literal image itself, okay? But somebody usually has to go in and curate that. That's a word that's being thrown around a lot. What that really means is usually an expert nurse or pathologist will review the record. They will document, where that staging information was in the record, and that it was sort of cited that way. But there's a potential that people are doing that in different ways. And I'll just give you an example. What if instead of reviewing the imaging, I'm just looking for a mention of stage 3 in the note, and I see a mention of stage 3, and I say, yep, the stage changed from 2 to 3 on date X. That might determine your calculation of progression-free survival time, right, which is a major efficacy measure. And what if that stage note was incorrect, or it was referring to a previous staging, or that happened 3 months ago, not today? And there are all kinds of reasons. By the way, none of them, most of them not nefarious, by the way, that could be true. It could just have to do with how they were documenting at that practice. It could have to do, with the way the EMR was structured. There's a variety of things. But think of that. There was a 3-month date shift in the actual day that stage changed. And we're calculating an efficacy measure on progression-free survival, meaning how long was the patient okay until they progressed to another stage. That type of impact is what frightens people, because the consistency on that right now, the top end firms I think are all doing that in a really clear way, and there's standard setting happening, but it's not consistent across everybody. And if you're a regulator or a payer or a physician, frankly, knowing that there might be a difference in how that was done is critical to know. And so I think within that, where we're headed for is the ability to do audit, because what you really want to know, I mean, let's remind ourselves, clinical trials aren't perfect either, okay? And the reason there is 21 CFR Part 11 compliance and EDC capture and all those things is because they were wrought with problems on how they collected information at certain sites. There's stories about people just like filling in all the paperwork, the Friday before it was due, even if it happened, months before. I mean, I don't need to go through that history, but the bottom line is with real world evidence and based off real world data, you want to be able to go back and audit it. I want to see the imaging file that you looked at to determine that stage progression happened. And you should be able to pull that up, pretty easily and consistently across. So, I think that level of standard setting is going to be important. I think there's other things about how data is collected and where it's collected from that matter. Something I've found in my career is, the type of physician entering the note, whether that by specialty or by training, they'll document things in different ways. The difference between a community oncologist and Memorial Sloan Kettering and what they might document at each place might be different. So being able to describe and understand those complexities and meeting them to a framework that determines standards, I honestly think that's the way forward for all of us. And again, I would say this doesn't mean the only useful data is the data that meets that standard, right? There can be other data standards, maybe lower grades, that are very useful for instructing things and also allow us to incorporate a broader view and more patients and more backgrounds, and can be instructive that way. But I think we need to know. It's almost like you need if you're thinking about like, buying a steak at the supermarket, there's grade A, there's, the certain standards. You need to be able to put a sticker on it and say, this is what's here. And know when the sticker's there that you can go back and audit that if needed. There might be a compliance or QC report associated with it. You can review it. And for the most part, that does not happen today consistently. And, I think we should look to that as a way to do it. And again, this gets back to my point as CEO of Atropos, which is what we really want to know is, and taking a regulatory view for a second, for the question I'm asking, and the population that drug might be treated with, are we using the right data set to answer that? Is it a good match? And you could even say, did we recruit the right trial participants? It's the same type of question. Same thing we're talking about real world data. If I'm at institution X and I'm asking a question about, how will this therapy work in my patient population, there should be kind of a lookalike mentality to that, and I'm giving it high level titles like that. But what I'm really talking about is statistical technique, right? There are ways to sort of evaluate, grade, and match those things, which is something at Atchipo we're thinking a lot about. So we want to be able to tell doctors, not just, hey, there's one big trial, this is what it said, that's close enough to your patient, there you go. We're thinking about how could you say, well, let's translate that evidence locally. How does it match to your patient population, your infrastructure of care, your care team, your care management, and localize and personalize that evidence. So, but we're a ways out from this, the regulators and what industry's doing, like they got to solve these pieces. And I think once they do, folks like Atchipo, bring that right to the doctor's front door.
Interesting. A couple of interesting questions have come to the chat here. Let me start with the first one. This is around your comments about synthetic control, and the audience member says yes, it has advantage in many therapeutic area trials. But can you shed some light on opportunities in neuroscience trials where the site, the environmental factors are significant covariates?
Yeah.
How do I use synthetic control arm there if where I did the trial matters?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, I mentioned it. I think neuroscience and neuropsych are particularly difficult areas, or I don't know that they'll be difficult. They have different complexities that you're mentioning in your comment that need to be considered. Ultimately, I think there's maybe opportunity there as you start to think about what's being collected digitally now for some of those trials, as well as molecularly and as well as from imaging. Ultimately, I think perhaps RWD can be instructive or even help lead, that process. But I agree, today that is a significant challenge, and I think it's why those divisions of the FDA are being particularly careful and thoughtful. Let's remember, by the way, that like these areas, neuropsych in particular, were the areas where the placebo effect was discovered, right? And where a lot of these topics around randomization really came from. Having come from a department at Tufts, was originally led by Louis Lasagna, actually the inventor of placebo effect. I'm very sensitive to that. But again, I look to the opportunity, like what new sort of measures can we derive and sort of use to lead the next generation. But there's work to do there, I would say.
Absolutely. And I would think FDA actually use the real world data effectively, because while that is the case for synthetic trial, they actually allowed the pragmatic trial to be in the label for risperidone. So maybe 2 minutes, tell us what are pragmatic trials, and what's the utility of those?
Yeah, I mean, that's the funny thing, right? This same group of researchers and regulators are probably the most sophisticated at trial design and statistical sort of approach. And, so in a way, they may be best suited to, start to think through some of these different ways of doing things. And, in pragmatic trials, you might be talking about, sort of moving between arms and groups. You might be talking about sort of adding people at different stages of disease. I think about what I said about a continuum. I mean, a lot of those designs are actually the basis of the designs of some of these sort of future, more contiguous, between clinical trial to real world data and back design. So bizarrely, I think that community is in a great place to lead on this discussion. But measurement is still a challenge in that group. And I think that's, one of the things that faces a methodological challenge, but they have the background to do it. So.
Yeah, very good. So I would recommend our audience to look at the Risperdal label. That one has a very good example of using pragmatic trials for labeling. Although it made it in the clinical studies section, but label nonetheless. And the other question is, how about then the NCEs? for surrogate, where surrogate endpoint is for clinical efficacy. How would we think about using synthetic control there?
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll see. I mean, like, pick our battles. I think we'll get to some of that stuff. I'm super excited about, the space of trial simulation, particularly when you're including biology and pathway biology and doing that. I think we're just at the beginning of being able to tap, this sort of repository of not only clinical information, but biology and omics linked to that, and what it could mean about discovering new chemical entities. Novartis has their Data 42 initiative. Observing from the outside, that looks like it could be super interesting around understanding how mechanisms impact clinical disease in different patient groups. That's ripe for reanalysis and prediction. And I think we'll see a next generation of, let's call it, clinical simulation, biological simulation companies, coming to the fore. More to prove there, but from my perspective, it's sort of inevitable with the wave of clinical information, increasing linkage, to that biologic information, and helping us plan for these NCEs, right? So what can I understand if the mechanism is similar or different? If the pharmacology is similar or different, what can that tell me about what might happen in my trial? Maybe we design better trials, do better recruitment to start, but maybe from there it goes even further and you can simulate it on larger populations, bring that RWE at the simulation stage. So we design a better trial to begin with, right? And those are exciting areas as well.
Very nice. So I think continuing on that, maybe your final thoughts on, as you just said, where should we go from here? There are things we need to do. So as a community, as even as regulators, where should we go from here?
Yeah, I think if you are an RWD or RWE company in the space, or somebody analyzing that data, be thinking about provenance, be thinking about auditability, documentation, be thinking about how you're sourcing your data, not from a perspective of like, this is good data, this is bad data, but about maintaining that clarity in what is behind that data and documenting it clearly. I think that'll be crucial. And then, as we think about, the ecosystem of data enhancement, how do we sort of make this data as close to on par with clinical trial data as we can, and then build infrastructure to connect and capture it throughout. I think that level of infrastructure will be really critical in the next phase. But like I said, I think the tech is there to do it, where maybe it wasn't even 5 years ago. So I could see that being an explosion of what happens next.
Very good. So with that, Brigham, thank you on behalf of Vivpro as well as our audience. This was engaging. I learned a lot, and as you mentioned, there is plenty of opportunity in this area, and looking forward to connecting with you. For our audience members, our next webinar will be in September. It will be on value and role of regulatory intelligence in pharma. We'll announce the speaker in a subsequent notification. If you can take 1 minute of your time before we close this, if you can answer one poll question that Holly has put up, how likely are you to recommend Vipro's webinar to your colleague? Appreciate your answer, as well as if you have any feedback or if you have a topic that we should be discussing, please send us a note and we will be more than happy to schedule one. So with that, again, Brigham, thank you very much, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for having me, Praveen. Thanks, Ari, for attending.